The terrain. For many Americans, the war in Europe was a battle over maps, vast plains, historic cities, and paved highways where the steel rain of U.S. artillery and Sherman tanks could dominate. But the Pacific was a different beast entirely. It was a jagged, claustrophobic nightmare where the Earth itself seemed to fight back. Here, the landscape consisted of ancient coral ridges, impenetrable rainforests, and an unstable volcanic crust that rendered Western tactical superiority almost irrelevant. At Iwo Jima, this environmental lethality reached its peak. The ground wasn't solid earth, it was a fine, black volcanic ash with a steep 40-degree incline right at the water's edge. The horror was immediate. As Marines scrambled to dig life-saving foxholes under heavy fire, the ash would instantly slump back in, like dry sand in an hourglass, leaving men trapped on the surface, standing completely exposed to hidden Japanese mortars with nowhere to hide. Further south, atolls like Peleliu presented a different agony. The coral was as sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, crystallized calcium carbonate that could shred a standard pair of combat boots in less than 48 hours. Because of this, the advance of the 1st Marine Division was reduced to a bloody crawl. At the height of the struggle, progress wasn't measured in miles, but in a mere 15 to 20 yards per hour. In this labyrinth, the mighty American war machine was stripped down to the most brutal, primitive form of combat: one man, one rifle, and a terrifyingly small patch of ground. Underground fortresses? In the Pacific, the Japanese military transformed entire islands into sunken fortresses, fundamentally changing the psychology of infantry combat. In Europe, an enemy bunker was usually a visible target on the horizon. In the Pacific, the enemy was invisible, fighting from within the Earth itself. They carved elaborate honeycombs into volcanic ridges, subterranean labyrinths that made traditional American air and sea power feel almost useless. The sheer resilience of these positions was terrifyingly illustrated during the Battle of Okinawa. American battleships, including the USS Tennessee, would saturate the ridges with massive 16-inch projectiles, each weighing roughly 1,900 pounds. Yet, the moment the smoke from this devastating bombardment cleared, the Japanese defenders, safely cocooned within caves engineered to withstand direct hits from these exact shells, needed only 15 to 30 seconds to return to their machine guns before the first American boots even touched the sand. To counter this, U.S. troops turned to the most horrific weapons in their arsenal. The flamethrower became the primary tool for cave flushing, a grim mechanical process of literal suffocation. The scale of this brutality is etched in the logistics. To neutralize just one localized complex of tunnels on Iwo Jima, American units burned through over 10,000 gallons of gelatinized gasoline, or napalm. This was a war of extinction fought in total darkness, where victory was measured by how many men could be sealed alive inside a mountain. The climate. The greatest killer in the Pacific was often not the Japanese, but the environment itself. This theater was defined by stagnant equatorial heat and relentless tropical downpours, creating a rotting effect far removed from the cold but manageable aridness of Europe. Humidity levels routinely hovered at 90%, transforming the jungle floor into a mud-choked nightmare that consumed both gear and spirit. American logistics struggled to supply equipment that could survive this biological assault. The standard issue. Trench boots designed for durability were no match for the jungle. The moisture was so extreme that it caused the heavy-duty stitching and glue to literally dissolve from the inside out. This forced GIs to require a complete replacement of their combat boots as often as every 15 days, as the soles would frequently separate entirely, leaving soldiers to march through razor-sharp coral in shredded leather scraps. This environment literally consumed the men who fought in it. Historical medical records from the American Division at Guadalcanal provide a devastating look at the physical toll. Between the non-stop dehydration, heat exhaustion, and chronic diarrhea, soldiers were losing an average of 15 to 25 pounds of body weight within their first 30 days on the line. They weren't just fighting an enemy, they were watching their own bodies waste away in the heat. Malaria. In the early years of the Pacific War, commanders feared a microscopic parasite more than Japanese steel. Malaria, transmitted by relentless clouds of mosquitoes, inflicted far more casualties than bullets or bombs. For the American GY, the war was a secondary struggle compared to the fight for biological survival. During the New Guinea campaign, the situation reached catastrophic proportions. In several units, the ratio of malaria casualties to combat casualties was a staggering 10-to-1. Field hospitals were overwhelmed by men shaking with uncontrollable fevers rather than the wounded from the front. Historical logs from companies stationed in the worst swamps indicate that combat effectiveness often plummeted to less than 20%. In a typical 150-man company, only 30 soldiers might remain strong enough to actually hold a rifle, leaving the perimeter dangerously exposed. To survive, the U.S. military enforced atabrine discipline, requiring every man to swallow a bitter synthetic drug under officer supervision. However, the cure carried its own psychological weight. As the atabrine dye accumulated in the tissue, it slowly turned the soldiers' skin and the whites of their eyes a distinct, sickly shade of bright yellow. This jaundiced appearance became the haunting visual hallmark of the Pacific Theater, a constant yellow-hued reminder that in this war, the air you breathed and the water you stood in were just as lethal as the enemy in the trees. Tropical disease. Beyond the headlines of grand naval battles lay a grimmer reality. The Pacific was a biological meat grinder. While soldiers in Europe contended with occasional outbreaks of trench foot, those in the South Pacific faced a relentless onslaught of jungle rot, dysentery, and fungal infections that turned the human body into a host for decay. This was a war where the enemy didn't just shoot at you, they waited for the environment to dissolve your ability to stand. In the mud-choked foxholes of the Solomon Islands, jungle rot became a literal nightmare. This wasn't just a simple rash. In the constant humidity, a small scratch could transform into a weeping, necrotic ulcer within days. Medical officers documented cases where untreated jungle rot on the feet and lower legs would eat through layers of muscle and connective tissue until the soldier's own metatarsal bones were visible through the open sores. The impact on military readiness was catastrophic. According to statistics from the 14th Corps, dysentery alone was so pervasive that it crippled combat effectiveness. In prolonged jungle operations, the physical exhaustion from chronic intestinal infections caused units to operate at a mere 40% of their intended strength. Men were often forced to keep their fingers on the trigger while their bodies were literally wasting away, turning the act of simply remaining at a post into a feat of agonizing endurance. Disease versus bullets. The fundamental horror of the Pacific Theater can be summarized in a single, grim statistic. Disease killed and incapacitated more Americans than Japanese lead. In the European theater, the primary threats were artillery fragments and high-velocity rounds. But in the Pacific, a soldier was more likely to die slowly in a canvas field hospital than instantly on the battlefield. The scale of this biological attrition was unprecedented. During the liberation of the Philippines, the intensity of environmental hazards reached a breaking point. U.S. Army medical records from certain sectors in the Philippines indicate an infection rate of 5,000 cases per 1,000 soldiers per year. This statistical anomaly meant that every single soldier was being hospitalized or treated for a different, debilitating tropical illness at least 5 times every 12 months. While a soldier in Europe might recover from frostbite and return to civilian life whole, the parasites of the Pacific were often life sentences. Many veterans returned home carrying malaria or exotic parasitic infections that would trigger relapses for decades after the surrender. Unlike the wounds of Europe, which were often visible and surgical, the scars of the Pacific were internal, persistent, and a haunting reminder that they had fought a war against a continent that wanted them dead. Bushido. To understand why the Pacific was the most hated theater, one must look at the psychological wall American GIs hit, the Bushido Code. In Europe, the German Wehrmacht followed a recognizable Western tradition of surrender when a position became untenable. In the Pacific, the Japanese military viewed surrender not as a tactical option, but as the ultimate unforgivable disgrace to the emperor and the ancestors. This created a total war at the individual level. Every Japanese soldier was indoctrinated with the Senjin-kun, or the Code of Military Conduct, which every man was required to memorize. The core tenet of this manual was absolute. Never suffer the shame of being taken prisoner, a directive that transformed every foxhole into a fight to the death and ensured that a defeated enemy was more dangerous than a living one. This fanatical devotion extended far beyond the battlefield. Japanese soldiers were taught that if they surrendered, their families back in Japan would be stripped of all social standing, denied government rations, and permanently cast out as traitors to the state. Consequently, the American soldier wasn't just fighting a man. He was fighting a soldier who believed his own death was a religious requirement. This psychological deadlock meant there were no short skirmishes, only small, localized genocides, where the only way to end the battle was to eliminate every single soul in the opposing trench. Banzai charges. The tactical heart of the Bushido Code was the banzai charge. It wasn't a military maneuver. It was a high-speed human wave of pure terror. Unlike the disciplined retreats of the German Wehrmacht, these were ritualistic acts of collective suicide designed to shatter the American mind. For the young machine gunners, these charges represented a descent into a primal horror that no training manual could ever describe. The desperation reached a sickening peak during the Battle of Saipan. In July 1944, the largest banzai attack in history was launched, involving nearly 3,000 Japanese soldiers. The sight was grotesque. Charging through the darkness were hundreds of wounded men, some hobbling on crutches, others with their arms in slings, clutching nothing but a sharpened bamboo spear or a rusted grenade, screaming "Tenno Heika Banzai" as they ran directly into the muzzle flashes. This wave of human flesh put an impossible strain on American hardware. The water-cooled M1919 Browning machine guns were fired so continuously that their barrels would glow cherry red and frequently seize up. Gunners were forced into a frantic race to swap barrels while the enemy was literally leaping over piles of their own dead to reach the foxholes. The trauma of having to mow down thousands of men in a single night left many GIs in a state of permanent shell shock, haunted by an enemy that chose a bayonet over a white flag. Surrender rates. The most striking statistical gap between the European and Pacific theaters lies in how the wars actually ended for the individual soldier. In Europe, when a German unit was encircled or outmaneuvered, they generally surrendered as a cohesive group, following the recognized laws of land warfare. In the Pacific, however, the concept of a unit surrender was virtually non-existent. The numbers provide a chilling contrast. During the final months of the war in Europe, millions of German soldiers actively sought out American lines to surrender. Contrast this with the Battle of Kwajalein, where the statistical anomaly is staggering. Out of a Japanese garrison of roughly 8,000 men, only 51 soldiers were taken as prisoners of war, a surrender rate of less than 1%, with many of those captured only because they were unconscious or too severely wounded to trigger a grenade. This was the standard, not the exception. Across the Pacific, the ratio of Japanese killed to those captured remained an incredible 25-1. For American GIs, this meant there was no off-ramp for the violence. In Europe, you could win a battle by capturing a city. In the Pacific, you could only win a battle by exterminating its inhabitants. This lack of a surrender culture turned the war into a grim, mechanical process of liquidation. American soldiers didn't view their enemy as people who could be negotiated with, but as a lethal force that had to be completely erased before anyone could go home. A war without end. Because the enemy refused to yield, the Pacific War devolved into a cycle of mutual hatred and relentless brutality that surpassed the conventions of the European front. For the American soldier, the primary psychological burden was the realization that clearing a battlefield was never truly finished until every body was accounted for. There was no concept of a peaceful occupation here. There was only the grim work of ensuring the dead stayed dead. This necessity gave rise to a terrifying habit that became standard operating procedure. American troops learned early on that a fallen Japanese soldier was often a ticking time bomb, as many would hide a Type 97 hand grenade beneath their bodies, waiting for a medic or a curious GI to approach before pulling the pin in a final act of spite. Consequently, Americans were forced to verify corpses using small arms fire or grenades from a distance. The result was a pervasive no-quarter mentality. The rules of engagement shifted toward a policy of total elimination, where the act of taking prisoners was often discouraged. This cycle of violence stripped away the thin veneer of civilized warfare. While veterans of Europe might recall shared humanity, veterans of the Pacific remembered a biological struggle for survival, a conflict where hatred was as essential as a rifle. The lethality gap. The probability of survival for an American soldier was fundamentally different depending on which side of the globe he fought. In the European theater, being wounded often meant a ticket home. The medical chain was efficient, and the enemy generally respected the Red Cross. But in the Pacific, the ratio of those killed in action compared to those wounded was significantly higher, revealing a much more ruthless brand of warfare. The statistics reveal a dark truth about this theater. On average, the U.S. military saw 1 soldier killed for every 3 wounded in the Pacific, compared to a 1-to-4 ratio in Europe. This discrepancy was a result of deliberate Japanese policy. They targeted medics specifically and made every effort to bayonet or execute wounded Americans before they could be evacuated. The intensity of this carnage reached an impossible peak at Iwo Jima, where the total number of Marines killed or wounded, exceeding 26,000 casualties, actually surpassed the entire 21,000-man Japanese garrison defending the island. This remains the only battle in U.S. Marine Corps history where American casualties exceeded those of the Japanese. In this theater, a wound was rarely just an injury. It was a desperate race against an enemy that viewed a helpless, bleeding soldier as a target to be finished rather than a prisoner to be saved. The legacy of horror. Decades after the guns fell silent, a clear cultural divide remained among World War II veterans. While those who fought in Europe often returned with stories of liberated villages and shared Western humanity, Pacific veterans were shrouded in a traumatized silence. This was the hated theater, where the soul was eroded by both a fanatical enemy and a predatory nature. The difference in their memories is visceral. In post-war interviews, a veteran of the 101st Airborne might recall the beauty of the Bavarian Alps, but a veteran of the 1st Marine Division would only speak of the suffocating smell of rotting jungle and the sight of maggots in their own wounds. To exist in the Pacific, American GIs were forced to abandon their sense of humanity. They weren't fighting a traditional army, but an enemy that turned every square inch of mud into a miniature genocide. This was the Japanese's ultimate unfair advantage. They fought without the restraint of mercy, forcing Americans to become equally cold killers just to survive. For those who came home, the Pacific was a nightmare they could never leave behind. Thank you for honoring the history of these brave men with us. If you found this deep dive valuable, please hit the like button and subscribe to join our community of history enthusiasts.